Welcome to this video. In this video we're going to discuss the autoimmune disease called multiple sclerosis, which for short is often abbreviated simply down to MS. So before we begin this video, let me just give you an outline for the structure of this video. So we're going to begin by going over the basics. So we'll discuss what multiple sclerosis is, and we'll discuss what are the symptoms that individuals suffering with multiple sclerosis can actually suffer with. After we've done that, we'll talk a little bit about the epidemiology of multiple sclerosis. So we'll discuss things like how rare it is. And after that, we'll discuss the classification of the different types of multiple sclerosis. Once we've done that, that's the basic introductory bit done, we'll then start the major part of the video, which will be on the pathophysiology of multiple sclerosis. So what is actually believed to be happening? What's our best current ideas about what is actually happening in someone who is going to suffer with multiple sclerosis? And once we've discussed pathophysiology, we'll end the video by talking about the current drug treatment for multiple sclerosis, and we'll try and give some explanation as to potentially how these different drugs work to treat multiple sclerosis. So, let's begin then by going over the basics of what multiple sclerosis actually is and what the symptoms of multiple sclerosis are. So, multiple sclerosis, I've already said it's an autoimmune disease. Now, what does an autoimmune disease mean? So, an autoimmune disease is a disease where the body's own immune system is going to attack some of its own tissue. Now, of course, the immune system is fantastic. The immune system is there to fight infections. If you get the flu, which is a viral disease, the immune system is the bodily system that will eradicate this disease from the respiratory tract. However, this fantastic system can go wrong. It can end up, in some people, attacking the body's own tissue, and this can result in massive destruction of the body's own tissue, and therefore the immune system can actually end up causing disease by attacking some portion of the body's own tissue. This is what is meant by an autoimmune disease, and multiple sclerosis is believed to be an example of an autoimmune disease. So the immune system is going to attack some of the body's own tissue. The question is now, which part of the body is going to be attacked in multiple sclerosis? And I'm afraid the answer is not nice. The part of the body that gets attacked in multiple sclerosis is the white matter tissue of the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord. So let me just write some of this down here. So the tissue that is fundamentally going to be attacked in multiple sclerosis is the white matter tissue of the central nervous system. So we will abbreviate white matter down to WM for short. So, let me firstly just make sure that everyone understands what the difference between white matter and grey matter is within the central nervous system. So for this, allow me to draw a little picture of the central nervous system over here. So we'll start by drawing the brain. So this is going to be a very, very simple picture. We want to draw the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. It's not going to be any advanced neuroanatomy. It's going to be a picture I'm sure you've seen before. We're just going to imagine we've taken the brain and the spinal cord out of the bony encasements, so the skull and the vertebral column, and we are looking at it from the left-hand side. So I'll just draw this here. So this is the left cerebral hemisphere viewed from the left-hand side. We have the frontal lobe here, so this is the front, the parietal lobe here, the occipital lobe here, and the temporal lobe down there. Then, of course, it's not just the cerebral hemisphere that makes up the brain. You're also going to have the brainstem peeking out from underneath and the cerebellum behind the brainstem. So I'll put this here. So here's the brainstem, which remember is effectively the continuation of the spinal cord inside the skull. And then this thing coming down, that's supposed to represent the spinal cord. And then just to complete this up, I'll put on the cerebellum here. So just to go over the different bits, we have the left cerebral hemisphere here, we have the cerebellum in this position here, and then we have two bottom portions of the brainstem here. This bottom bit here is meant to represent the medulla, and this bit above is then the pons. Above that you then have the midbrain, but we can't really see that because it's more in the center of the cerebral hemispheres. And then all of this bit down here, this is representing the spinal cord. So let me just put some very basic annotations on here. So down below we have the spinal cord here, and then up at the top we have the brain, and together these two things are known as the central nervous system, or the CNS for short. So it's the white matter of the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord, that is going to be attacked in multiple sclerosis. So what do I actually mean by the white matter? So when you look at the tissue of the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, you can divide very, very crudely, and indeed people did this years ago when they were looking at little slices of central nervous system tissue underneath the microscope. They broadly divided the tissue into two different types, namely the white matter of the central nervous system, and then the other type of matter, you probably know just from common lingo, is the grey matter, which we can abbreviate down to the GN. And very simply, the white matter was paler than the grey matter. So grey matter appears darker underneath the microscope, whilst white matter appears lighter. Now, what is the actual significance behind some portions of tissue within the brain appearing darker, i.e. being classified as grey matter, and other portions of tissue appearing lighter and therefore being classified as white matter? Well, the significance is that, of course, the whole of the central nervous system is made up of brain cells, neurons, and those neurons have a cell body and then also often a very long axonal process coming off. So if we draw a basic picture of a classical neuron, and neurons come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Within the central nervous system there are loads of different types of neurons. However, the classical picture of a neuron, if we were to draw a classical picture, it looks something like this. So you have the main cell body here of a neuron. So we've got some cytoplasm and then the nucleus at the center there. And then off this cell body comes processes, and there is one very long process, like so, known as the axon or the axonal process. So I'll also just label up, this is the cell body over here. And then also off the cell body you'll have some smaller processes coming off like this. This is the classical neuron. As I say, not all neurons look like this, but this is the classical picture that everyone likes to draw. And these smaller processes, these are called dendrites. And of course, when a neuron fires an action potential, an electrical signal, that electrical signal propagates along its axon. What determines whether it fires an electrical signal? Well, it's receiving inputs from loads of other brain cells onto its dendrites, and depending on what those other brain cells are telling it to do, it decides whether it's going to fire an electrical signal or not. So the dendrites collect information, the axon then issues information out, is the output of the neuron. So this is a classical picture of a brain cell, a neuron here. Neuron's the fancy name for a nerve cell or a brain cell. Okay, so why have I told you all of this? So the important thing is that these brain cells have a cell body where the axons are very close by, and then they have a long process which is their axon. And the axon is electrically insulated, and this will go over in much more detail later on when we come on to pathophysiology. But know for now that this axon has electrical insulation around its length, and that electrical insulation is known as myelin. Okay? So axons are ensheathed by myelin, which is electrically insulating them. This is the origin of the two different types of brain or central nervous system tissue, the grey matter and the white matter. Grey matter tissue is where you have lots of cell bodies of neurons all clustered together. So for instance, the surface of the cerebral hemispheres, known as the cortex of the cerebral hemispheres, and also the cortex of the cerebellum, this contains loads of cell bodies of neurons, and therefore it appears grey because the cell bodies are quite dark. If you then penetrated in deeper into the cerebral hemispheres. So you imagine you've got a little drill, you've drilled through the grey matter, the cortex on the outside, and you're now going into deeper layers. That's where there aren't many cell bodies. There's now loads and loads of axons all coming from the cell bodies that are on the surface and going to other areas of cerebral cortex. And this is the white matter, because this is where all the axons are, and the axons are electrically insulated by this myelin substance, and the myelin substance is light. It appears white. So this is why this tissue is referred to as white matter. So overall, in the central nervous system, grey matter is where the cell bodies of the neurons are going to be present, and white matter tissue is where you have loads of axons present. And the classic examples are the cerebral cortex is an example of grey matter tissue, and then if you penetrate deeper in underneath the cerebral cortex, you then get to white matter where all the axons are, and it's the myelin that ensheaves the axons that is making that tissue appear white. So, not only in the cerebral hemisphere, but also in the brainstem, the cerebellum, and also the spinal cord, you can divide tissue into grey matter, which is where cell bodies are, and white matter, which is where axons are. And in multiple sclerosis, you are going to get an autoimmune attack on the white matter of the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord. Now, note, in multiple sclerosis, you do not get attacks on white matter in the peripheral nervous system. So this is a very important point, and I think I'll change colour and put this in red to highlight how important this is. So the entire nervous system can be split into two major parts. The central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord in the bony protective casing, the skull and the vertebral column. And then there is the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. So this P here stands for peripheral nervous system. And this is where all the nerves that are outside of the central nervous system are classified into. So off the spinal cord, and indeed also off the actual brain, come nerves. So the cranial nerves come off the brain, and off the spine, of course, spinal cord rather, we have loads of spinal nerves coming out. Those are not considered part of the central nervous system. They are considered part of the peripheral nervous system. And even though those nerves will consist of loads and loads of axons, they, and therefore are considered white matter, they are not going to be attacked in multiple sclerosis. So multiple sclerosis does not attack white matter of the peripheral nervous system. So your peripheral nerves do not get attacked in multiple sclerosis. Only white matter in the brain and the spinal cord get attacked in multiple sclerosis. And we will justify why later on. It has to do with the fact that the myelin is produced by a different type of cell in the central nervous system compared to the peripheral nervous system. But we'll discuss that in much more detail later on when we come on to pathophysiology. Okay, so multiple sclerosis then, it's an autoimmune attack on white matter tissue within the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. Now this means that you end up with lots of lesions forming in the brain and the spinal cord, and indeed this is the reason that multiple sclerosis is called multiple sclerosis, because you get multiple lesions, and sclerosis kind of refers to these lesions that form. Now, this is an important point that you might be a little bit confused about when you're learning about multiple sclerosis for the first time. You might think if you've got an autoimmune, an autoimmune attack on the white matter of the central nervous system, isn't that just going to destroy the entire brain and the entire spinal cord? Surely all the white matter will get destroyed and you'll die. That's not what happens in multiple sclerosis, and we will try to give an explanation as to why that doesn't occur in multiple sclerosis when we go on to pathophysiology. There is a beautiful explanation. Whether it's right or wrong is more difficult to say, but there is a beautiful explanation that does provide a very logical answer as to why you don't get complete destruction of all the white matter. Instead, what happens in multiple sclerosis is you get little patches of your white matter in the central nervous system damaged by the autoimmune response, and we call these the white matter lesions. So this is what happens in multiple sclerosis. You get lots of white matter, so I'm using my abbreviation WM for white matter, and you get lesions, which we can also refer to as plaques, and indeed people like referring to plaques in multiple sclerosis. Okay, so I'll say it again. In multiple sclerosis then, you are going to get multiple little lesions forming in the white matter of your central nervous system. We refer to these as white matter lesions or white matter plaques. You do not get every bit of white matter in the central nervous system destroyed by this. So to draw a very crude representation of this, on my picture of the central nervous system here, I will draw some plaques in red here. So you might get little plaques forming in white matter all over the central nervous system. So each one of these red blobs here is representing an area of white matter in the central nervous system that is being attacked by the autoimmune disease. So what I'm trying to really hammer home here is that you get discrete lesions. It's not the case that every ounce of white matter that you have in the central nervous system all gets attacked in multiple sclerosis. That's not the way it works, and I will attempt to give you an explanation as to why that is when we come on to pathophysiology. Okay, so there is what multiple sclerosis is. It's an autoimmune disease where we attack the white matter in the central nervous system and you get discrete white matter lesions, also called white matter plaques, forming within the central nervous system. The next thing I want to discuss before we go on to epidemiology is to try and go over symptoms with you. Now, this is a big topic that I could do in a lot more detail than I'm going to do. I could now explain to you all about how the brain works, all of the little pathways that I understand that exist within the brain, and exactly why you will get certain symptoms if these little pathways are affected, but that would take forever. So instead, what I'm going to say to you is the brain and the spinal cord do a huge number of things. Think about how much they control. They are, the control center for the entire body. White matter is important in every single system that the central nervous system controls. Therefore, multiple sclerosis can affect any function that your brain and spinal cord has. So you come up with any function that your brain and spinal cord is involved in doing, multiple sclerosis can hit that. Therefore, there is a huge number of symptoms that people can get with multiple sclerosis. I'm going to go over some of the major ones, but I will miss things here. And I'm not, as I tried to say a moment ago, I'm not going to go through all the different pathways that I know about in the central nervous system to justify all of these symptoms. Instead, we will just go through a list of symptoms and we'll say, the brain does this, and therefore lesions to the brain and the spinal cord can produce these, but we won't go over the current understanding of the pathways involved in doing these, because as I say, we'd be there all day if we were to do that, if we were to go over all of neurophysiology. Okay, so let me put a little title here then. So we now want to discuss symptoms of multiple sclerosis. So as I've justified, there are a huge number of different possible symptoms of multiple sclerosis because anything that your brain and spinal cord does can be hit by this disease. By the way, I should stress that when you get one of these lesions forming in a portion of white matter, that causes problems with the functioning of that portion of white matter and therefore causes problems for whatever that portion of brain was actually involved in doing. I hope that was obvious, but I just wanted to spell that out. So that's the reason that the lesions are actually going to lead to the symptoms. So the piece of brain that has the lesion does not just carry on with its function as normal, it stops performing its function as normal, it starts doing something totally wrong, and that's what creates the symptoms in multiple sclerosis. I should also actually add, when we're discussing these white matter lesions, that when this occurs, you don't get pain actually coming from the lesion. Now, one of the symptoms of multiple sclerosis is that you can get pain, but it's not the normal type of pain. So, I'm just going to talk about this before we actually go on to the symptoms. So, let me pick an interesting colour firstly. So, I'll put it up here. So, you don't get a type of pain called nociceptive pain because of the multiple sclerosis lesions. So what do I mean by this? So, let me take an example. If you get inflammation occurring in a portion of skin on your body, let's say we go to the hand on your body and you have inflammation occurring there, you would get pain coming from that place where you have inflammation occurring, where you have the immune response attacking whatever it is in that tissue. So inflammation means that the immune response is attacking something in that area. It means that the immune system is involved in that area. So normally when you get inflammation occurring somewhere, which is what's happening in these lesions, you're getting inflammation occurring in these white matter areas, in these white matter lesions. Normally, if that was to occur in a peripheral portion of the body, that will cause pain coming from that area. And that sort of pain is called nociceptive pain because it involves the activation of nociceptors. It involves the activation of pain neurons. So let me just draw a little picture of a pain neuron. So all over your body, especially in your skin, you have pain neurons. And on the end of the pain neuron, so here is the axon of a pain neuron, on the end of the pain neuron is a special little structure that looks rather like a tree, branching out like this. So this could be in your skin, for instance, in the dermal layer of your skin. And this structure is called a nociceptor because it senses noxious stimuli. So a noxious stimuli is the fancy term for a painful stimulus. So noxious stimulus means a painful stimulus. So in most tissues within your body, particularly in the skin, you have pain neurons or nociceptive neurons. So the neuron here, the fancy term we would use for that would be to call it a nociceptive neuron. So this is the axon of the nociceptive neuron that will be going to relay the information into the central nervous system. And on the end of it, it has the structure that actually senses the noxious stimuli, which is called a nociceptor, and it's this tree-like structure that I have drawn you here. So all sorts of noxious stimuli can activate this nociceptor. It can cause the nociceptive neuron to fire action potentials, and that will create the sensation of pain. It will relay the information into the central nervous system. The spinal cord will relay it up to the brain, and you will feel pain. That sort of pain is called nociceptive pain. When the pain has come from the fact that you have activated nociceptors, that's called nociceptive pain. Okay, so when you get inflammation occurring in an area of skin, you get loads of mediators released into the extracellular fluid, and this would activate the nociceptor and cause the nociceptive neuron to fire action potentials, and therefore you get nociceptive pain in that area. When you get inflammation occurring in these portions of white matter in the central nervous system, that is not going to cause nociceptive pain, and the reason is that the brain and spinal cord are not innervated by nociceptive neurons. Okay? Well, here's the great piece of evidence for the fact that the brain and spinal cord, the central nervous system, are not innervated by nociceptive neurons. When people suffer from strokes, a great big portion of the brain ends up dying because of lack of blood supply. And they get all sorts of horrible neurological symptoms. Loads of things go wrong. They often end up paralyzed on one side of their body, losing the ability to talk properly. All of these horrible neurological symptoms occur. But usually the stroke is painless. Even though a great big portion of the brain has died, it does not cause pain. Contrast that to what happens when people have a heart attack. When people have a heart attack, the same thing happens in the heart. A great big lump of the heart dies because of lack of blood supply in a heart attack, and they get absolute agony in the center of their chest. They get a crushing chest pain that most of them describe as the worst pain they've ever felt in their life. So That's because the heart is actually innervated by pain neurons. There are nociceptors within the heart, and therefore when great big lumps of the heart die, they don't like that at all. So, the central nervous system is not actually innervated by nociceptors, no pain neurons, and there's your evidence, the fact that strokes do not hurt. So when you get these multiple sclerosis white matter lesions forming within the white matter of the central nervous system, you're not going to get nociceptive pain usually. So the formation of this lesion doesn't actually cause a headache or anything like that, because the white matter is not innervated by nociceptors. Okay, so no nociceptive pain because of these multiple sclerosis lesions. So let's now go on to the symptoms that people can get with multiple sclerosis. So there are going to be a lot of symptoms, as I previously said, because these lesions can occur in any portion of white matter within the central nervous system and therefore can cause dysfunction in all sorts of neurological circuits. Okay, so let's try and categorize it up. So we'll start by going over sensory symptoms that people with multiple sclerosis can experience. So we'll start with sensory symptoms. So, one of the things that people can get is that they can get numbness in certain areas of their body. So I'll put this here. So numbness is one of the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, and hopefully you can understand why this is, even if we don't actually know all of the ascending tracks, the pathways by which information is communicated up to the brain from the peripheral nervous system. Hopefully we can still understand why you might get numbness. So, sensory information that is coming in from your body is going to be relayed from the peripheral nervous system into the spinal cord mainly, and then the spinal cord is going to deliver this information up to the brain where it will be processed. That's a very basic account of how the sensory system works. If you get a white matter lesion in the spinal cord, hopefully you can understand that that might interrupt the transmission of the information up the spinal cord to the brain, and therefore you might no longer be able to actually deliver sensory information from certain areas of the body up to the brain, and therefore it will never actually become conscious information. So this is why people can get numbness in certain areas of their body when they have the white matter lesions of multiple sclerosis, if those white matter lesions have formed in the spinal cord. So, numbness is one of the sensory symptoms that people can get with multiple sclerosis. Another sensory symptom. So, numbness is obviously because the lesion has caused lack of function now. The portion of white matter that has been involved in the lesion is no longer actually going to deliver electrical signals up anymore, so the information is not going to get up to the brain. The next symptom that I'm going to put here isn't because no signals are getting through anymore, it's because the area that is part of the lesion is actually going to produce aberrant signals now. So this next symptom is what we call paresthesia. So this is a fancy word that means tingling sensations. It's strange sensations. When you get pins and needles, that you can fancily refer to as paresthesia. That's what is meant by paresthesia, that strange sort of tingly feeling that isn't pleasant. It's not a pleasant feeling at all. An unpleasant tingling sensation. That's what is meant by paresthesia. So again, hopefully you can understand why this might occur in multiple sclerosis. If you get lesions in the white matter of the spinal cord, this could lead to problems with the delivery of sensory information up from certain areas of the body, and that area that is lesioned might now send out incorrect signals up to the brain, and the brain would interpret those incorrect signals as a tingling, unpleasant sensation coming from the area of the body that area of white matter that is lesioned was actually delivering sensory information up about. So you can get numbness in certain areas of the body because of lesions in the spinal cord, and you can also get paresthesia in certain areas of the body because of lesions in the spinal cord. And I shouldn't just say lesions in the spinal cord, because the information has to go up through the spinal cord, up through the brainstem as well, to be processed by the cerebral hemisphere. So also lesions in the brainstem could lead to numbness and paresthesia as well. Anything that disrupts the communication of the sensory information up to the cerebral hemispheres is going to potentially lead to numbness in certain areas of the body and paresthesia in certain areas of the body. Okay, so more sensory symptoms. You can also end up with painful sensations coming from certain areas of the body. Now, I just said that multiple sclerosis, the lesions do not cause pain, but I said it very carefully. I said actually that the lesions of multiple sclerosis do not cause nociceptive pain. However, they can cause a form of pain, which is neuropathic pain. So these are the two major different types of pain that exist: nociceptive pain versus neuropathic pain. So nociceptive pain is where you experience pain because nociceptors have actually been activated. They have fired action potentials up the nociceptive neurons, and it's being communicated eventually up to the cerebral hemispheres along some pathway from the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system and up to the cerebral hemispheres. Neuropathic pain is very different. Neuropathic pain is pain because of the incorrect functioning of the pathways that are communicating this information. So certain areas of the body, let's to take a specific example, just draw a little picture here. So let's say we've got our little individual here who's going to unfortunately suffer from multiple sclerosis. And let's say that they have spinal cord lesions that are in a portion of white matter that is taking information up, sensory information from their right leg here. So we're imagining he's looking forward at us. So this is his right leg. So let's say he's got a white matter lesion in the portion of the spinal cord that is actually transmitting up sensory information from his right leg here. He might end up with a lot of numbness in that right leg. He might also end up with paresthesia, strange tingling sensations in that right leg, and he might also end up with pain in that right leg. And that pain is not nociceptive pain. It's not because nociceptors down in his leg are actually being activated. It's instead because the axons that are taking information up to the central nervous system about painful information from his right leg are misfunctioning. They're firing aberrantly because of this lesion, and that creates the sensation of pain down in the right leg, even though there is no activation of nociceptors down in the right leg. So when the pain is generated by the neural circuitry that is communicating painful information up to the cerebral hemispheres, that's referred to as neuropathic pain, in contrast to nociceptive pain. So when you experience pain as a symptom of multiple sclerosis, it's usually neuropathic pain rather than nociceptive pain, because remember, the central nervous system is not innervated by nociceptors. Right, we'll have a break here. In the next video, we will continue on going through symptoms of multiple sclerosis. We'll go on to motor symptoms at the beginning of the next video, and we'll continue on through different categories.